Right, so your blocks, your resistance to healing from grief. This is such an important topic. I always say that whether you heal from grief or not has nothing to do with all the things people think it has to do with. Whether or not it can heal, it doesn't matter who died. It doesn't matter how old they were and how they died. It doesn't matter how long ago it was. It doesn't matter how close you were to them. It doesn't matter how the grief has impacted you. It doesn't matter your background or your beliefs or your IQ or your EQ. The only thing that will be a determinant in whether you heal from grief or not is your beliefs around grief. That's what will stop you from healing, is the beliefs that you hold and the resistance that they create to healing from grief. I'll often have people trying to tell me that it's impossible to heal from grief. It's not. I've done it. This is what I do in my work. This is what I help people do. And if somebody holds that strongly enough, then I can guarantee 5, 10, 20, 30, 50 years down the line, they will still have their same grief. Not because it doesn't go away and it can't go away, but because of their beliefs and because of that resistance. And what the beliefs mean is that something in them wants to hold on to it. And this is the common for most people. This is really common for most people. I had someone not so long ago asking me, just in a setting outside of my work, had no idea what I did and was asking me about it. And then I said about working with grief, and she talked about a death in her life. And when she really got her head around what I was saying, I said, I don't help people cope. I'm not a therapist. I'm not coping, managing. This is not a support group. Help people heal completely from grief. She said, oh gosh, well, I think it's important that people have the grief and kind of backed away. And there's almost the urge in me to say, you don't have to worry. I'm not coming for your grief. And if you want it, I can't take it. There's nothing I can do. In fact, I can promise you, if that's how you feel, you're going to have it for the rest of your life. Because something in you wants it. So that's where these beliefs come in. That's where this resistance comes in. And it's such important work to clear that. So there's two real types of beliefs that you can have, two real types of resistance. And one is, I think, is more universal, and it's the crap that we've been told about grief, right? So it's these very common ideas. You'll read them in books on grief. You've heard them in grief groups. Your friends who are grieving still will tell them to you. You see them all over memes on Facebook anytime someone's writing about death and grief. These ideas that grief is love. These ideas that grief is somehow a measure of love, or grief is the price you pay from love. Anything that links grief to love, whether because grief is love not wanted to let go, any ideas around that, you loved, therefore you grieve. So that this, again, the idea that somehow your grief is a measure of your love, an indication of your love. And ideas around what's respectful, right? That it would be disrespectful not to be in grief. And ideas around that the grief is how we remember someone, it's how we keep their memory alive, or how we keep part of them alive. So if we didn't have the grief, then what? If we've forgotten about them completely, is it like it never happened? Is it like they never mattered? So all these sets of beliefs, and a lot of that should sound familiar to you because you would have heard it before, and you've seen it before, and you've read it before, and just about every article that someone could post on Facebook or send to you about grief will include at least one, if not all, of those ideas as truth. So the problem with them is that if you believe in that stuff, you will not want to heal from grief. And so you won't. It's that simple. You won't. And it makes perfect sense. If you believe that your grief now is what your love has somehow turned into, why would you give that up? If you believe that your grief is a measure of how much you loved the person, why would you give that up? If you believe that your grief is how you remember them and how you keep their memory alive, why would you give it up? It doesn't matter how painful it is, right? If you believe that without your grief, it's like they never happened and you'll forget them and you are very disrespectful and you're then a terrible daughter, son, husband, wife, partner, friend, parent, why would you give that up? Right? So there will be, no matter how much you might say, this is horrible and I wish I didn't have to feel this way and when will this ever end? And part of you has a really, really strong motive for holding that grief. And while you have all those, you're not going anywhere. You're not going anywhere. For, understandable, you have this huge resistance to the idea of being out of grief. And it makes perfect logical sense what's happening there. So this is why, in my work, there's a huge part of the work we do, which is clearing out all these beliefs, clearing out all these resistance. Because if somebody doesn't want to heal from grief, or they say they do, but there's a big part of them that really doesn't, it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So it's really important to get to spend time with your beliefs and get to know them. Now, I said there was two different types of beliefs, two different types of resistance. So those are that side I consider a lot more universal. The other side, really interesting and fascinating to me, is that they're very different from person to person. Very different from person to person. So they're just your own individual ones, your own individual reasons for hanging on to grief. It could be stuff around identity. This can happen if somebody feels like their identity was completely tied up in this person and they don't know who they are without this person, particularly if they didn't have a lot else going on, And the classic example, it's not always the case, but it can be, is say a woman whose husband has died and maybe he was everything, maybe she never had her own career, maybe she didn't have much of a social circle, didn't have a lot of interests, her marriage was everything, and then he dies and she doesn't even know who she is without him. So it's not just the death of him, it's the death of her identity. And that can happen for all sorts of reasons, for all sorts of people, but that's just kind of a classic example. Not for every person whose spouse or partner has died, but it does happen. In that case, you've got someone who has a motive to hang on to their grief because grief can be a safe place to hide. Better the devil you know, it can become a place where you don't have to face the question of what next in my life, because that can be a really frightening question if you don't know what's coming next, right? It can be a really scary place for most people, I think. The void of what the hell happens next in my life. Who am I now? What am I going to do? Can be too huge, especially for someone who's, for anybody, but, somebody who's a bit older who's never really faced that. Grief can be a very safe place to live, and I've seen this in people. Grief can become an excuse. I worked with someone once who he'd had multiple deaths in his life, very challenging deaths, and he had gotten to a place where he blamed them for everything. He was very depressed and unhappy and suicidal, and that was the fault of his grief and these deaths. Work problems, relationship problems, anything that was wrong was on the grief. And it had become this cycle where he kind of needed his grief to blame everything on, because when I looked at it with him, his relationship had been really suffering before the deaths. He just wasn't happy with his work. He just wasn't happy with his work. But it had become convenient for him. It wasn't a conscious thing to blame everything on the grief, and therefore he didn't have any responsibility. He didn't have to do anything about it. And actually, when we looked at it, he stopped at one point. He said to me, but if the grief's not responsible, then I am. Shit. Yeah, but the thing that he could see in that space is that while the grief was being, everything was being pinned on the grief, everything was being pinned on these deaths, he had zip power. He had absolutely no power whatsoever to change anything, because none of it was his fault. None of it was, he couldn't do anything about it. You know, it was while he was in grief, he couldn't do anything about it. So he had a really strong motive for his grief by that point. Again, not conscious. It took us some digging to find that, but he really realized it had become what he could pin everything on. Because it's a hard road to sit and go, okay, what kind of life have I created? Do I hate my work? Is my family life shit? Am I in a crappy relationship? Am I miserable where I am? Am I in a space I want to live in? Are my friendships what I want them to be? It can be a hard road to have to admit to yourself where you are, and then admit to yourself you've gotten there, and the only one can do anything about it is you. That's a hard thing to do. A lot of people don't ever want to do that. Other things that can come up for people are if they have beliefs that are really strong that they feel might be moved. You know, I had a client once who had a particular belief about the world and how things worked, and she was self-aware enough to say, but if I'm not in grief, then that's going to throw my belief into kind of disarray, so I kind of need it so I can hold this belief of mine, which she's very firm on. But she was really able to see that she'd kind of backed herself in a corner there. With other people, it can be all sorts of things around, you know, other stuff around family, other stuff around business, other stuff around ourselves. We can, somebody who has found themselves a lot of connection through grief, right? Somebody who's very much connected to other people through the grief, very big in grief forums and stuff like that. Easy place to get stuck, because then your ticket to that community is your grief. And for those people, the idea of being out of grief could be intolerable, because then they no longer have the ticket to that community. They won't fit in anymore. That can be a big loss. You know, someone who has maybe started a business or a charity or started some amazing pursuit on the back of the death of someone might feel like, without my grief, is all this pointless? Do I then have to let it go? You know, all sorts of intricate. It's fascinating to me, because each person that comes to me, it's really, really different. And these are just some examples. I mean, not every client, but almost every client will show me something new that I hadn't seen before in terms of a belief. And what happens with these beliefs is that they become a boundary, they become a brick wall. And it is so important that you do something about it, because you can do all the healing work you like. I could sit with you and take you through the other steps of my process, or, you know, if you find somebody else who's working around grief, specifically talking about healing it, they can take you through everything that they do, all this wonderful magical stuff that they can do that might help you heal. But if part of you wants that grief, needs that grief, it will hang on to it. You know, you will yo-yo back. You either won't get past a certain point, or you'll start to, and back you'll come. So it's, you know, I remember someone saying to me once, you're always talking about how to clear these beliefs. Why don't you just tell us how to heal? And it was someone who I knew in particular had not cleared their beliefs, had not cleared their motives to stay in grief, had not cleared their resistance. And I said, because the rest is pointless until you genuinely want to heal from grief, and you don't have big parts of you that want to keep you right where you are for whatever reason. It's as pointless. It's a waste of everybody's time. You're not going to get anywhere. So it can be tempting, I know, to go, oh, I don't have those. Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. I worked with one client ever who we genuinely didn't find any belief. She's the only one. And maybe you're the second one, but probably not. And I certainly wasn't. That was my initiation, was when I sat doing my first lot of work on my father in the first environment where I discovered a different way to understand what had happened in my life with the death and then the grief. Up came all my resistance. Up came all my resistance that I didn't want to. The big thing that came up for me was that I didn't want to let go of my grief, because I said, and people said, I'm not ready to let go of my dad, right? Not ready to let go of him. The idea that he is somehow the grief. that the grief is more than my emotional experience, that the grief is actually some part of him, which is a really, really, really common one because we get fed that. That's the nonsense we've been fed. We've been fed it by Kubler-Ross writes it in their books. Most of the big grief experts will write about this. So I believed it, and maybe you believe it, and so many people do. So it is really important to stop before you try and do anything else, because it's no good trying to do all the other steps and then come to me and go, oh, it didn't work, I'm not healed. Damn right you're not, if you've still got all these walls that are going to come up. And the thing to realize about them is they're not bad. These walls are not your enemies. They're actually your friends. They're parts of you that are just trying to help you. They're trying to stop you from doing something that they think is going to harm you. That they're trying to keep you in a place that they think you need to, that these parts think you need to be. I think of it like your old great aunt, she's a nice lady, but she has your best interests at heart, but her ideas of what you need are not what you need, She doesn't understand, why do you even need to go in the next town? It's nice in your suburb. You don't need to go taking any risks. You don't need to change. It's safe here. We don't know what comes next. This is where everything you want is, right? So she's not a bad person. She's not trying to do you harm. She's just very misguided, right? And that's what these parts of you are. They're just misguided. I talk of them as parts because I think it helps to personify them, to know that it's not you. You're not trying to actively do something. It's these beliefs, these ideas, these boundaries in you, these walls in you that for whatever reason want you to stay right where you are. So the thing to do is, first you get a piece of paper, you make a list. If there's anything you've heard me say, note that down. Any of these beliefs that you've heard me mention and you went, yeah, I believe that, write it down. And just ask yourself as well, okay, what am I frightened would happen if I had no grief? No grief, no pain, no missing, no longing, no regret, no guilt, nothing left but love for this person for the rest of your life, and that's all you have, and the grief never comes back, and the missing never comes back. What are you frightened you might lose? What is the risk? What are you worried is going to happen? What are you worried you're going to be without? Write down whatever comes up. Okay, that's the first step, is to identify what these beliefs are, what these walls are, and it can be quite interesting to see them, because when you realize you've got 3, 7, 10 different walls there, you can see that you were never going to get through them. You're never just going to get through them like that. So write those down. And I've blogged before on different ones of these. But really, for most of them, it's just about looking at them from a logical place and really questioning them. So, for example, the idea that grief is love. When you hold that one up to the light, it makes no sense whatsoever. Love is love is love. I mean, are you saying now that you don't actually have any love for the person? What you have is this pain, and that's what you have, and that's somehow love. No, you have the love. The love is a pure and easy connection of feeling, but it's underneath all that. Your negative experience of someone else's death is not suddenly your love for them. Your upset or your anger or your regret or your guilt is not somehow what your love became. Love doesn't become anything but love. Love is love is love is love. It doesn't turn into something else. It gets covered up with different emotions, and then it's harder for you to reach. So, a lot of these beliefs are like that, where you can question it, look around it and go, hang on a second, that doesn't make sense, because people don't look at grief. They don't get to see how completely illogical some of the stuff is. And for the other ones that are more personal to you, again, they just need to be questioned. So, this guy that said to me, God, if I don't hang everything on my grief, then I'm responsible. We were able to see, well, how is that helpful to him? And realize that it wasn't, because his only choice in that place was to stay stuck in grief and it meant everything that happened that he was unhappy with, he would hang on the grief. He was powerless. He had made himself completely powerless to change anything, to give himself a better life. He'd made himself completely powerless. And when he could see that, he went, yeah, that's not going to work. You know, this is not how I want to live. Yes, it's a bit confronting that I'm going to have to face the fact that I need to make changes. And it's not all about the grief. But no, my life is not going to work that way. So it's really about spending time. And if there's some that are too hard to look at yourself, that's fine. You can send me an email if you want, because I can do some videos or some blogs on particular ones, if you have particular ones there. But if you get to some, you're like, I don't know how to shift that. I don't know how to look at that differently at all. Then just move to another, because you'll probably have enough of them. But this is key. Don't even bother trying to skip this. If you're going to skip that and kind of read other blogs or watch other videos or anything like that of mine, you're going to get a lot of nice theory, but what you're setting yourself up for is too much inner battle. Way too much inner battle. It's far easier when we can find those walls and go, well, that doesn't make sense. Just melt them and then move forward. Right? Really important. Really, really, really important. So give it a try. Like I say, if you find any particular beliefs, any walls, any resistance that you just have no idea where to even start questioning that one, send me an email and I can look soon to do maybe a particular blog or email on that piece. Alrighty, lots of love. Till next time.